you very much indeed. Hopefully this is all going to work, though we have had some technical hitches, but we'll see if it all works. Anyway, thank you very, very much for having me. What a fantastic kind of full room, and glad to see none of you watching political debates at home. So we live in an age of eco-anxiety, and it seems every time we open the paper or we hear the news, there's some other devastating sort of impact that we have caused the planet. Recently, the UN produced a report saying that we're in danger of losing 1 million species from the planet. So that's 1 million species about to go extinct thanks to us. We've got 5 trillion pieces of plastic floating around in the oceans. The RSPB recently said that we've lost 44 million birds from our skies since the 1960s. So in this sort of background of cataclysmic loss, the great American biologist E.O. Wilson, in one of his recent books, Half Earth, said that if we want to get back biodiversity, if we want to restore ecosystems, and these are the systems not just that wildlife out there survives on, but that we as a species ourselves depend on, then we have to give half Earth back to nature. And that means not just leaving nature in wilderness areas and national parks. It's way, way, way much more than that. It's bringing nature back into our own backyards. It's living with fully functioning nature again. So the question is, how do we do that? And I think our project at Knepp, sort of minuscule as it is by this kind of global scale, nevertheless, I think it shows in just 20 years, it's shown astonishing results. And it's shown results not just in biodiversity and huge increases, and some of the rarest species in Britain have now been attracted to our project, but also all sorts of other pressing questions like climate change, soil restoration, carbon sequestration, flood mitigation. All these other questions also come into play. So I think our little project has much, much bigger resonances. And ultimately, it's a story of hope. And so we need a bit of that now, and it's wonderful to be able to tell a positive story. So this is where we are. The cross is so big, it's almost covering up where we are right now. Knepp is only about 20 minutes from here, but not the way I came just now, which sort of doubled the time. But we all know where we are. And this is where we live. This is Knepp Castle at the heart of the estate. It's a Nash castle built by John Nash, the architect for my husband Charlie Burrell's family about 220 years ago. It sits at the middle of a 3,500 acre traditional estate. So it's very conventional, and ever since the Second World War, it's been ploughed up and used intensively as an arable and dairy farm. At least that's what it is when Charlie and I inherited it in the 1980s. But I think it's very important to recognise that this idea of kind of maximum production, in which our estate was kind of part of, this idea that we must produce food from every available inch of land, is not actually that old. It really goes back to the Second World War. And this is what happened during the Dig for Victory campaign, and we all know what happened. You know, our supply lines were severed, we were facing starvation as a nation. The government incentivized every landowner, every land manager, every farmer to plough up every available inch of land. And that included losing commons, losing cricket pitches, even the South Downs, which were sacrosanct during the First World War, all went under the plough in the name of this crisis to produce food for ourselves. And here you can see, this is Charlie's grandmother's writing in the sort of bottom left-hand corner, a fine wheat crop. And so this is in the Repton Park around the house. It's probably land that had never been ploughed ever in history. And it was ploughed up for the Dig for Victory campaign. And you can see the Canadian Army in the background being reviewed by the Duke of Gloucester. They were stationed at Knepp during the war. And so what happened during the Second World War was an intensification in every direction of agriculture. But before the war was even over, there were agronomists, highly respected agronomists, who were arguing and trying to persuade the government that we go back to a system of rotational farming, because they could already see the damage it was doing to our soils. Because we were ploughing every single year, planting the same crops in the same land ad infinitum, we were losing soil structure very, very fast. And we know now what this system can do. When you start adding chemicals to it, it's absolutely devastating. We have scientists now talking about having 100 harvests left across the planet before we have no topsoil in which to grow anything. So this was the start of a very, very sort of divisive way of treating our soils. And it began in the Second World War. And of course, the agronomists weren't listened to, and we went down the route along with America, Europe, Russia, much of the world into intensification. And we were allowed to do that because of the advent of chemicals. So of course, these chemicals came on the scene, artificial fertilizer, which looked like we could carry on using our soils in this way, ploughing ad infinitum, growing the same crops over and over and over again, without, it was a miracle, at least so we thought. And of course, what happened was overproduction. This is something that is very rarely talked about. The food and farming industry do not like to talk about it. But we know we are producing on this planet enough food for 11 billion people. We're about 7.5 billion people now. And what happens is that we are wasting 40% of it. So in the industrialized world, we waste it from our plates. We waste it when it's harvested from the fields because there's a wonky carrot that won't be accepted by the supermarket. In the developing worlds, it's wasted because the commodities cannot get to market. There isn't the infrastructure, the refrigeration facilities, the roads to get that product to market. So we're wasting 40% of our food as it is. And a lot of it is wasted. Charlie and I have just come back from the States, and we were driving up through California. We drove through mile upon mile of red peppers that were just not going to be harvested because they had these tiny blemishes on them. They were perfectly edible, but they weren't ready, weren't good enough for the shops. We drove through mile upon mile of grapefruit and orange trees. Again, they weren't going to be picked because the commodity price had changed. So we are overproducing food. And what happened shortly after the Second World War, we were producing so much grain that for the first time we started feeding grain to cows. And we called it grain-fed beef. And this was a kind of thing to celebrate, and it was going to be even more delicious. And then, of course, we started feeding grain to dairy cows, and even, God forbid, to sheep. And now we're feeding it to our cars. We simply have to keep creating mouths to consume all this food that we're producing. So this is the kind of system, this sort of cycle of soil destruction and overproduction and inefficiency that we've fueled thanks to largely farming subsidies. And this is really what the landscape, much of it, looks like today, and we consider it normal. We assume that it's right that every available inch, particularly in the lowlands, should be ploughed and devoted to arable crops. But it's not surprising when you look at this picture that our biodiversity has just fallen off a cliff edge. So we lost 97%. We've ploughed up 97% of our wildflower meadows since the Second World War. We've put barely any of them back. We've pulled up 75,000 miles of hedges. We've lost almost all our lowland heathland, almost all our lowland wetland. And this is what we have instead. And we think it's normal. We've forgotten what the landscape looked like before the Second World War. We have that sort of cultural, national amnesia about our much richer landscape that was before the whole industrial agricultural system kicked off. Well, this is Knepp 20 years ago. And we thought there was absolutely nothing wrong with it. Except that when we took over from Charlie's grandparents in the 1980s, it was losing money, the estate. It was losing money hand over fist. And we assumed that it was, I suppose arrogantly put it down to Charlie's grandparents. We levelled the blame at them. We assumed that they had not been investing in infrastructure and they didn't know all the latest technologies that were coming online. Charlie had been to agricultural college, felt he kind of knew how to make a go of this farming business. He was a child of the Green Revolution, a misnomer if ever there was one. But he really felt that we could do something and make this into a profitable business. So for 17 years, that's exactly what we did. We did what every good farmer is supposed to do. We bought bigger machinery, we invested in infrastructure, we took 6 dairies and amalgamated them into 3 dairies. We bought state-of-the-art milking parlours that looked like something out of NASA. We even tried to diversify into Charlie Burrell's Castle Dairy ice cream. I don't know if any of you remember it, but we were so excited about it about 15 years ago. It was about to go national when the Darth Vader of ice cream makers, Haagen-Dazs, came over with that $1 billion, you remember that sort of glitzy, sexy campaign, and blew us and Lowesley and all sorts of other luxury ice cream producers out of the water. But of course, we were also trying to experiment with new varieties of crops, and all of this meant putting more and more chemicals on the land. So more fertilizer, more pesticide, more herbicides, more fungicides, drenching the soil in chemicals in an effort to make it produce more. And we did increase our yields a bit, but we could never, it seemed, get anywhere near as the lovely loamy soils over in Chichester, which we could hardly even look in that direction. And the reason was this. It's Sussex clay. It's good old low-wheeled clay. So I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this, but or perhaps not if you're on this lovely chalk. But I tell you, in the low-wheeled, this is what completely governs your life. So I think the Inuit are supposed to have dozens of different words for different types of snow. Well, in the West Sussex dialect, I think there are over 35 different words for mud. That's how much it completely kind of obsesses you. If you, in a very, very hot summer, it suddenly opens up with these incredible cracks, and you can put your hand down a crack, so it gets all the way up to your shoulder. And in a wet winter, wet autumn like this, which can go on for months and months and months, you simply cannot get heavy machinery onto the land. So you can, maybe from the end of October to March, you just cannot get heavy machines onto the land. So you can't sow spring crops, you can't maintain your ditches, you can't do any maintenance at all. And that makes you completely ineffective when it comes to sort of trying to compete with lovely loamy soils over in Chichester. So this is what we were up against the whole time. It wasn't Charlie's grandparents, after all. It was the soil beneath our feet. But it took us 17 years to realise that. And finally, in 1999, Charlie made the big decision to give up farming. And it was a big decision because it was a very emotional decision for us. We had to make our farm manager redundant, who was a good friend. We had to make 9 other men redundant. And we had to sell our dairy herds, which were consistently in the top 10 dairy herds in the country. So it wasn't like we were bad farmers. It just wasn't stacking up for us. But I think it was a kind of bigger decision than that, because I think from the point of view of Charlie's family particularly, but also from our neighbours, what we were doing seemed incomprehensible. This is farming land. This was meant to be farmed. And the fact that we were giving up was seen often to be kind of lazy, irresponsible. I think we had one letter from a neighbour saying that they thought we were being unpatriotic. And so it was very difficult to make this decision without knowing what we knew, which was the economics. We just could not go on anymore. But what happens, and I don't know if any of you have been in this position of being in a failing business, but when you're in that failing business, you are completely in a tunnel. You're tunnel visioned. So you're looking for every moment of a sort of upturn in your fortunes. Can you survive to the next month, the next year? You're not thinking at all creatively or imaginatively. It's only when you actually say, okay, enough is enough, and we stop, that you can then actually stand back and look at what you've been doing and think much more creatively about where you should be going. And it was really in that kind of framework, in that sort of headspace, that we then met this incredible man, Franz Vera. He's on the right there with the grey hair. It just happened that in the year that we sold our farm machinery, we sold our milk quota, and we sold our dairy herds, we cleared our debts. It was also the year that this man's book, Grazing Ecology and Forest History, came out in English. And it was sending shockwaves through the sort of ecological and conservation community. Because what Franz was saying was that In all our imaginings of what our landscape in Europe, in temperate zone Europe, looked like before human impact, we've completely forgotten about all the free-roaming animals that would have been here. So we've forgotten about aurochs, about bison, about tarpan, about elk, reindeer, wild boar, beavers by the millions. And if you put all these animals back into the landscape and the great herds that they would have been here, the landscape that we have looks something much more like the Serengeti in Africa. It's not that sort of closed canopy forest that we have, that mythical Hansel and Gretel kind of idea that we have in our heads, the kind of place where a squirrel could have run from John O'Groats to Land's End without touching the ground. What you have instead is something much more open, much more dynamic, open to sunlight, that is rocket fuel for biodiversity. And all the ways that these animals disturb the ground, disturb the vegetation, their dung, their urine, everything they do makes for a much, much more dynamic landscape. And so what France is saying is that if you want to recover biodiversity, the way to do that is to put some free-roaming animals back in your landscape and just let them kick off the natural processes. Let them do the work of management for you. And then amazing things start to happen. And the key, which is the really difficult bit, for human beings at least, is to sit back on your hands and do nothing. Let them be the managers of the landscape for you. So we thought this was a really interesting idea. We thought, well, we could try and do something for nature on our land. And if we could just increase biodiversity, even by a fraction, then that would prove something. That would show that this chemically abused post-agricultural land can actually come back and could be useful for nature again. And so that's what we began to do. I think that first year, Charlie had the best summer of his life, smashing up all the old Victorian drains that had been trying so ineffectually to get water off the land, taking it out on them. We took up about 70 miles of internal fences. We took out fence posts, barbed wire, all that infrastructure. We just let those ditches just silt up. All that infrastructure that farmers have to cope with and maintain all the time, that's not actually paying them anything, but that's just part of the system, we were able to just stand back and let go. It was an amazing relief. And already that first summer, we began to hear insects, a sound we hadn't even known as farmers that we'd been missing. And as soon as the insects came back, of course, birds started coming back, and we knew we were onto something really exciting. And then thorny scrub started appearing in the arable fields that we just left fallow after their last harvest. And that thorny scrub started protecting new jay-planted oaks. So that's how trees regenerate in the landscape. We don't need to be going out there with spades and polypropylene tubes and tannalized wooden stakes and saplings from nurseries that might be bringing in disease. Nature can do it for us if we just let the thorny scrub come up. Anyway, after about 7 or 8 years of just allowing this to happen, we finally managed to persuade the powers that be, the government basically, to fund us so we could erect the ring fence around the whole area so we could release our free-roaming animals. And that's when we were able to start really getting the sort of dynamism back into the system by introducing the megafauna. Now, of course, we've lost much of our megafauna. Many of those species, the tarpan and the aurochs, we hunted to extinction. We almost lost the bison. That was almost hunted to extinction. I think a few individuals lasted in zoos in Europe. But they are coming back now and being used as wild herds in huge rewilding projects in Europe. They're proving to be a real keystone species. But obviously, we don't have bison in Britain. And we jolly nearly have beavers back, but not quite. We've just applied for our license to release them at Knepp, and we're waiting to hear if we can get them. But what we can do is we can use proxies for these animals. So we have the descendants of some of them. We domesticated their descendants, and we can use them instead because they have the same behavior patterns, the same methods of disturbance, possibly even the same gut flora. And so they have the same impact on vegetation, so they can act very much in the same way. So at the top here, we've got an Oryx. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the cave paintings of Lascaux in France, 17,500 years old. But that's a cave painting of an Oryx. And this is our Oryx at Knepp. It's an Old English longhorn. And obviously we're choosing the older breeds because they have to survive outside all year round. We're not supplementary feeding them. They're basically, to all intents and purposes, going to be out there in the wild fending for themselves. And so we choose older breeds that are much more kind of robust and resilient. But we think that the longhorn's doing a very fine job of looking like an Oryx at least. And of course, what these cows are doing out there is disrupting, impacting the vegetation. And the interesting thing about cattle is they don't just eat grass. So originally, they would have been browsers as well as grazers. And one of the important things about them, particularly for us, for our project, is that they can carry over 230 different seed species in their hooves, their guts, and their fur. So that's a really dynamic way of getting flora from one place. They eat in one place, travel sometimes miles, and then dung those seeds out in a perfect little pile of manure ready to take off again. And of course, they're transporting minerals and nutrients as well. So again, that's another sort of a process that we've completely forgotten about in our very static landscapes today. We've forgotten about how these animals would have moved nutrients all the way from the coast up to the tops of mountains. It's a very, very dynamic system that we just don't have today. And you can see that these bulls are great disturbers as well. They're turfing up the ground. And then we have our tarpan. So this is a tarpan, the extinct horse at the top. And standing in for the tarpan at Knepp is an Exmoor pony. I think it's astonishing how similar they look. Exmoors were down to only about 44 individuals in the Second World War. I'm ashamed to say, because the British Army was using them for target practice down on Exmoor. But they are now coming back, and we have one of the largest breeding herds of wild of Exmoors in Britain. And again, what they're doing is disturbing the vegetation. They're doing it in a very different way to the cattle, though. And I think this is so interesting. There's this relationship between equines and bovines is something that we've completely forgotten about in our sort of modern systems. Princeton University are doing a really interesting study in Kenya, it's so kind of counterintuitive, their findings. It's so much of rewilding. It's fascinating. But what they found in Kenya is that if you have 100 head of cattle grazing a given area, and you allow them to graze alongside an equine, and that could be a pony, a donkey, it could even be a zebra, those 100 head of cattle will put on more condition than if they were grazing that same area on their own. So you kind of think, well, how could that be? Aren't they keep competing for the same resource? But no, what's happening is that the horses have a completely different way of eating. They've got upper teeth for a start, unlike the cow. And they will be eating the really tough stuff, the sort of the thatchy dry grasses, here they're eating thistles a lot, the kind of things that the cows just can't stomach. And when you have horses taking that out, that enables all the sweeter stuff to come up, which then benefits the cows. So I have this vision in my head of kind of thousands of years ago, we would have had tarpan moving through the landscape, and in their wake you would have had herds of aurochs benefiting from the habitat that the tarpan had created for them. And then we have 3 different types of deer. So we had roe deer in small numbers at Knepp already. They're still in relatively small numbers, but we introduced fallow and red deer. And again, it's the same idea, different mouthpieces in the landscape, different ways of disturbing. We've just had the rut season is just coming to a close, and at Knepp, it's been, as usual, the kind of sound of this roaring and clashing antlers, and the air is just full of testosterone and pheromones and unbelievable stench when you go out there on a misty morning. And the fallow will kind of make these kind of lecking arenas, these kind of gladiatorial arenas where they urinate over huge areas, and then you have the red stags, and they'll all be sort of rubbing their scent glands against trees, against branches, and every little disturbance, every little impact they have on vegetation is opening up another niche for another species. So it has this huge domino effect for wildlife. And then my favourite, Tamworth Pigs. They're standing in for the wild boar. And one of the things that I find fascinating about this project is how extraordinary these de-domesticated animals behave when you release them into a landscape like this. I mean, who would have imagined that a domestic pig could behave like a hippo? And they can swim, and they can hold their breath, they can dive under the water, and they hold their breath for 20 seconds. And then what they're doing is they're looking for swan mussels. That's their absolute favourite thing. And they'll pull up these swan mussels from the bottom of the lakes and pull them to the side of the bank and then open them with their trotters and take the flesh out from inside. But what it demonstrates, I think, is that, you know, these animals are still full of ingenuity, full of curiosity, and those instincts are all still very much alive and kicking. And when you know, we were farmers, I used to look at our dairy herds with their heads down in a green field, and I thought they were perfectly nice animals, but pretty boring. But of course, it's not the animals that are boring, it's the situations we put them in. Release them into a landscape where they can just have free rein, and you see a completely different animal emerge. And we think that they are self-medicating, because a lot of these animals will go straight to a kind of patch of particular herbs. If a cow has just given birth, for example, she'll go straight to nettles to kind of restore her iron reserves. They'll often eat sallow, which is where we get salicylic acid for aspirin from. Again, it's fantastic for worm burden, for aches and pains, and they know exactly what they're doing. They have this amazing retention of kind of ancient sort of atavistic memory of what is good for them to eat. But of course, what the pigs are doing for us as well is, in a sort of ecological sense, is this disturbance of rootling. If you imagine that very heavy grass sward, it's actually quite a sort of retardant if you're trying to get back different shrubs and wildflowers into your system, because it's very difficult for seeds to penetrate that thick thatch. But as soon as you have a little patch that's opened up and that's kind of been rootled and you've got some damp, bare earth revealed, it suddenly becomes very complex, completely different. And we think it's thanks to the pig that we're now seeing a resurgence of native wildflowers. And I'm training myself never, ever, ever to use the word weed again. Plant life has a lot to say about this. But again, these wildflowers, these beautiful, delicate little wildflowers that we have zero tolerance for on our landscape, not just because we're so good at eradicating them from arable land, but also we don't let them into our gardens. We mow our roadside verges before they have a chance to appear. And of course, so many pollinators and insects depend on these flowers. And many of them, like these up here, bird's foot trefoil and scarlet pimpernel, red clover, fumitree, fluellen, vetches and vetchlings, they all have these tiny little seeds that are really protein rich, and numerous birds depend on them. So it's not surprising again that when we lose our wildflowers, we're seeing huge collapses in other wildlife. So this is what's happened at Knepp. This is what Knepp was like 20 years ago, and this is what's happened in the 20 years that we started to rewild. You can see how it's kind of healing itself and becoming much more interesting. A kind of woodland, a sort of wood pasture landscape, replacing the kind of bald, arable situation before. And this is what much of it looks like from eye level, from bird level, perching bird level. It's thorny scrub, and again, this is a habitat we have zero tolerance for in our landscapes today. Most farmers would look at that and call it wasteland, and just send in those big machines to rip it out. But this is one of the most biodiverse habitats we have. Not only is it a fantastic resource because it's got seeds, it's got berries, but it's also got that thorny protection, which is crucial for small mammals, for insects, and for birds, for nesting in. So this is where we're seeing at Knepp this huge kind of just explosion of life. And if you go out there on a spring morning and you just stand in that situation, the bird song around you is so intense, you can actually feel it reverberating in your guts. I mean, you can actually feel it in your stomach. It's astonishing. And it's changing the baseline, even for conservationists and ecologists who simply can't believe that you could fit any more birds into that area, but still they keep on coming. So I think it's a very important baseline, because it's making us look much more ambitiously at what we should be getting back when we're looking at restoring nature. And it's not just the key thing in this whole kind of balance of how the dynamism works is in keeping the numbers of grazing herbivores down. So if you've got these big mammals out in the landscape, if you allow the populations to increase and increase and increase, you'll eventually get an overgrazed area, and they'll run out of resources and begin to starve. But you don't want to lose that vegetation, because that battle between the animal disturbance and vegetation is what creates all the messy margins, which is the sort of the rocket fuel for wildlife. And neither do you want too few, because too few means that scrub will then go on producing trees, and eventually that will end up as closed canopy woodland. And again, that's very species poor and very undynamic. So you want somewhere in the middle where you've got vegetation coming up and succeeding in places, and you've got these big animals disrupting it. And that's what keeps it dynamic and ever moving in this kind of kaleidoscopic way. But it's not just the kind of biomass of wildlife that's interesting. It's also the species that have come back. We haven't introduced anything except for the big animals. So all these species have found us just because the habitat and the resources are now there for them. So we now have some of the rarest birds in Britain. And if I put all of the rare ones up on there, you wouldn't be able to see them because there's so many. So I've just chosen a few. But I mean, we've got ravens back at Knepp for the first time in 100 years. We've got lesser spotted woodpecker. We've got snipe. We've got woodcock looking amazing at the moment. You can see them in the evenings at the moment. We've got cuckoos. So many people keep saying to me how they don't hear cuckoos in the summer anymore. But you are guaranteed to hear cuckoos at Knepp. They're in every direction. We're also one of the biggest hotspots for nightingales. Again, a species that's declined over 90% since the 1960s, and we now have such a concentration of nightingales on our land. I think there's only one place that has more of them per acre, and that's Lodge Hill. It's an MOD site in Kent, which has now been zoned for housing, so unfortunately we may become the top spot. And then we've got peregrine falcons nesting in a tree, which is almost unheard of. And perhaps, I think this is, for me, it's the most poignant one of all. It's a turtle dove. So according to the RSPB, this is the bird that's most likely to go extinct from Britain in the next 10 to 15 years. You know, this is a bird that's in our cultural DNA. This is the stuff of Chaucer, of Shakespeare. It's what my true love gave to me at Christmas. And we're about to lose it. When I was growing up in the 1960s, we had 125,000 pairs of this bird. We're now down to just a couple of thousand. And we're going to lose that lovely touring sound that to me as a child was just as much the sound of summer as the sound of the cuckoo. But about 5 or 6 years into the project, we heard our first turtle dove. And this was astonishing because nobody had ever thought that we could have turtle doves on Knepp. We hadn't heard them, there'd been no record of them in living memory. And suddenly we were hearing them. This year we had 20 singing males. And it's very difficult to see turtle doves because they're so shy, presumably because there's so few of them. So the way you record them is only the males will do this lovely singing, this territorial singing. So you record the males. But we do know that they are breeding because we've even managed to ring a few fledglings. So we could have had as many as 30 or 40 turtle doves on Knepp this year. And according to Matthew Oates, who's the nature specialist at the National Trust, he thinks that we have more turtle doves on our 3,500 acres here in West Sussex than the National Trust does on 250,000 hectares. So it's astonishing how these birds can be surviving and thriving at Knepp. And then we've got all 5 species, UK species of owl, including the little owl on the left, which is now exploding in numbers because it's a beetle specialist. And of course, now we're not feeding avermectins, wormers and antibiotics to our livestock. That dung, in which dung beetles feed, is perfectly organic. So we're a magnet for dung beetles. Charlie, my husband, has this fetish, I think I would call it, for dung beetles. Or at least he's in love with dung beetles. And a couple of years ago, I couldn't work out what he was doing. He was following the cattle around with his mobile phone, and every time one of them did a cow pat, he would drop to his knees next to the cow pat. And I couldn't work out what he was doing, but he was timing how long it took dung beetles to find the cow pat. And I think the record was under 60 seconds. And that was all fine until he started bringing the cowpats into the kitchen, and then we had kind of cowpats on the table and glass things and unspeakable things in the freezer. But anyway, at the end of this summer, his record was finding 23 different species of dung beetle in one single cowpat, including one dung beetle, the violet door beetle, which hasn't even been seen in Sussex for 60 years. So, I mean, these must be clinging on somewhere in some little tiny pocket and then flying in, sometimes from miles away. And of course, once they're at Knepp, they can just explode. We've got 13 out of the UK's 18 species of bat, including this one, Bechstein's bat, which is so rare we don't know much about it at all. It's rare even in Europe. And we're now the biggest, we have the biggest breeding population of purple emperor butterflies. I'm ashamed to say I didn't even know we had purple emperor butterflies, but they are our second largest and one of our rarest butterflies, and they are astonishing. So when you think of a butterfly and they're kind of rather delicate things, sort of sipping on wildflowers and, you know, being very pretty, these aren't like that at all. They're incredibly sort of aggressive. They're almost like an honorary bird, so they're very territorial. They'll chase blue tits, they'll chase any bird that goes near their territory. You can throw up a stick and they'll try and chase the stick. They're absolutely astonishing creatures, but we now have this huge number of them emerging on Knepp every June or July. So the question, I think, really is how does rewilding fit into this picture, into our new kind of land? How are we going to get half Earth back to nature? Well, if you were going to ask somebody if someone was to ask you how to describe your countryside, I think quite a lot of people would describe it as this. It's a kind of picture postcard of the British countryside, our green and pleasant land. And this is what most of us, I think, consider quite beautiful. But it's only when you look at it more closely that you realise that actually it's a biological desert and that this is where everything is going wrong. So canalised river, you've got hardly any hedges, you've got nothing connected. Your cities, if you imagine some towns and cities on the horizon, they're completely isolated from proper nature. But so this is how I think rewilding can work and getting nature back into our countryside. Imagine that's a kind of rewilding project like Knepp up there in the right-hand corner. So that's your biodiversity hotspot. It's full now of species that are longing to break out into that wider countryside. But at the moment, they're not going to find any habitat out in that big picture. So what we've got to do is we've got to start creating wildlife corridors. We've got to get corridors connecting our very isolated pockets of nature. Some of our SSSIs, our sites of special scientific interest, are tiny. Some of them are even 10 hectares, that's all. Or something. I think there's one that's even 1 hectare. We have to get those larger, but we've also got to connect them so that populations within them have a chance to connect with other populations and breed, that they can get some genetic biodiversity back, but they can also move as climate change begins to affect the environment. They can move north, they can move to different areas. So we've got to get these wildlife corridors in, and of course we've got to do something about the roads, because otherwise that's just simply creating death traps. We've got to have land bridges. We are rubbish at this. We have been getting millions and millions every year from Europe to do things, projects like this, create land bridges. And most times we just send it all the way back to Europe because we haven't spent it. We have 3 land bridges in Britain, and compared to somewhere like Holland, they have hundreds of them. So they're really good at connecting areas of nature together. And of course, we've got to get back some of that 75,000 miles of hedges because they can be wildlife corridors too. And we know from our studies at Knepp that if you simply let your hedges grow out, if you let them double in size, that's perfect habitat for nightingales. We could get nightingales back so quickly if we just did that simple thing of restoring our hedges and letting them grow out double the width. And then we've got to let nature margins around our fields, our arable fields, our farming fields, because we know now, the studies that have taken 7 years that have proved incontrovertibly that if you have nature around your arable fields, even if it's chemical farming, your yields increase. So there's absolutely no reason not to have areas like this around your fields, because they're producing for you not only pollinating insects, but they're also producing the predators that eat the pests that affect your crops. So hugely important to get these nature margins back into agriculture. But we cannot carry on with agriculture the way we have. We have to stop chemical farming, and we've got to stop ploughing. It's as simple as that. The plough was one of the worst inventions that man has ever come up with. And we can do it. We can create... we can do regenerative farming, and there's a lot of people, particularly in the States and in Australia, where they're in real trouble, who are beginning to do exactly this. It's literally a grassroots movement, because it's happening with farmers on the ground who are realising that they can, by stopping ploughing and by stopping using chemicals and by doing a regenerative system, using cover crops, rotating their crops and using livestock in the mix, they can actually increase their yields. Their profits rocket exponentially because they have no costly inputs, and you're actually producing food that's not just more nutritious for you because your soils are restored and it's actually pulling up nutrients from the soil again, but it's actually going to be cheaper ultimately for the consumer because you're not having to pay for all those costs that the farmer has had to use up until now. If there was one book I'd recommend out of all of those, and they're amazing, all of them, but Dirt to Soil by Gabe Brown is the one. He is now in the top 15% of farm producers in North Dakota, and he's doing that with no inputs whatsoever. So he doesn't even irrigate in the summer like all his neighbours have to do. And in the winter, his soils are 6 degrees warmer than his neighbours because his soils are restored. And so that means he's doubled his season for growing crops. So he's even more, of an advantage than his neighbours. His story is absolutely astonishing. He's got some films on YouTube as well. So, regenerative farming, we can also do agroforestry and silvopasture. Again, 2-3-tier different systems of agriculture. You could have pigs in here. You could have any livestock in here. It's another form of restoring your soils and turning to a different kind of agriculture that's hugely beneficial for wildlife. And also, we've got to restore our wetlands. We've got to find ways not only of cleaning our water, because there's a huge cost to the public purse because of all this water that is polluted by nitrates and by soil that we are having to pay for in our water bills, because the water utilities companies charge us for the cost of cleaning our water. So we can do that by natural filtration systems. And we know that at Knepp, water that pours into Knepp from surrounding fields that is heavy with nitrates or that comes in off roads onto our land, once it's actually been through our soils and been through our vegetation, the water that sits on Knepp is of the highest possible quality. So we're acting as a filter, and that's a potentially hugely beneficial thing for ultimately our water bills. But also, it's a fantastic system for mitigating against floods. So, we're all facing this disastrous and ever-increasing likelihood of floods every year. One way to do that is to rewild in catchment areas, particularly upstream, and the restored soils and restored vegetation will hold back that water and release it much more slowly and much more safely, and we won't have the devastating floods that we have downstream. And we know that that's already happening at Knepp, that roads and bridges and buildings even that used to flood in big rains now just don't do that anymore. But of course, the one species that could do this for us is the beaver. We've restored a river at Knepp, or our stretch of the River Ada, and it took 7 or 8 years of feasibility studies. This was in conjunction with the Environment Agency. And then it took 2 years of Reg the digger driver digging another more wiggly river where the canal had once been. And then it took us another year of messing up what Reg had done so we could get it much more dynamic and putting woody debris blockage in and building kind of little dams and making riffles and ponds. A pair of beavers would have done that in 6 months, and it would have cost nothing. So this is our green and pleasant land. I hope it's not looking quite so green and not so pleasant anymore. And this is what it could be if we just open our heads, our minds a little bit, and allow some fully functioning nature back into it. And we haven't even talked about carbon sequestration. That last picture of the arable landscape is one of the biggest emitters of carbon. But as soon as you get this kind of landscape, it's pulling down carbon. It's one of the biggest carbon sequesters. So this is our biggest ally in our fight against climate change. If we can restore our arable landscapes and every possible area of nature that we can to this kind of wild, dynamic landscape, it's going to be hugely positive for carbon sequestration. And if you can imagine, there's a sea over there. That's marine, obviously. Restored marine areas will sequester carbon too. So what's happened at Knepp over that 20-year period has been astonishing. We started off hoping that we would increase biodiversity just a little, and we've seen that that's just gone through the roof. But it's also answering some of these other pressing questions, all these questions of soil restoration, carbon sequestration, flood mitigation. It's providing all these other public goods that we desperately, desperately need. But I think one of the things that's been most interesting on this sort of journey from being the kind of control freak farmers that we were to the sort of the wild side is the effect that it's had on us psychologically. That sort of feeling one gets when one walks out on a lovely summer's evening and you're walking alongside the scrubland and you can hear that turtle dove tooting in the thickets. It's that sort of feeling of completeness, that humming, buzzing, thrumming life all around you. E.O. Wilson again has this lovely word for it, biophilia, that innate desire in all of us to connect with living things. And I think that's what so many people feel when they come to Knepp, is that feeling that life is doing its thing. It's where it should be. So I think when we're talking about rewilding, why aren't more people doing it if there's so much to benefit us? Well, I think there are slowly, I think people are beginning to get really, really interested in it. Charlie likes to clock up the acreage, and this year we had, if you add all the acres belonging to the different farmers and landowners and land managers who came to Knepp, there were in excess of 1 million acres. So that's 1 million acres worth of people who are really seriously looking at Knepp as a way to do rewilding on their own land. And we've already had some big areas of land, and particularly there's a wonderful estate on the north coast of Norfolk called Ken Hill, which is about 5,000 acres, that has just announced its rewilding, and there's lots more in the pipeline. So it is very, very exciting. But I think there's a barrier for many people into making this leap. And I think one big barrier is aesthetics. It's this question of that green and pleasant land again. It's that concept that we have in our heads that we grew up with of what our landscape should look like. It's that feeling that having a controlled, micromanaged landscape is somehow good for us, that we're in control, that it's reassuring, and we may somehow have a sort of nostalgic connection with it. If it's a landscape we grew up in and have fond memories of, it's very difficult then to want to see it change. But I think we have to do that. We have to make that mental leap. We have to change our aesthetic if we're going to embrace rewilding. We've got to start to get messy. We've got to let go of that corseted Victorian obsession we have with tidying up. We've just got to let go, and we've got to relish boom and bust cycles of nature and the unpredictability of things, and animals perhaps in places where we'd never imagined them to be before. We've really got to let go and be generous and allow nature back into our backyards again. And that really is as much about changing our own mindset and opening our imaginations as anything else. It's essentially about rewilding ourselves. Thank you. Okay, this is a question about whether do I see Knepp as being agroforestry. There was a slide about agroforestry, and apparently it's been a subject today, and it's in the Green Party manifesto about a way we could go forward in different types of agriculture. No, Knepp isn't agroforestry, because what Knepp is really is a rewilding project. So it's all about nature and about getting natural systems back into a landscape. It's not about food production per se. I mean, we are still producing food. Because we cull the animals, we're producing 75 tons of venison and pork and beef a year. And that is an important income stream for us, and we're hoping that it will become even more important as we begin to produce charcuterie and things like that. And we think that there's a market now for people who are actually wanting to, if they're still eating meat, thinking about where they get their meat from and ethical meat sources. But it's not a food production system. Where I see Knepp is, as in that picture, it's a rewilding hotspot. It's a nature hotspot. So it's a way that you can connect, get wild areas connecting through your farmed landscape. But agroforestry definitely will be part of farming for the future. Yeah. Yeah, so this is a really important question. It's the economics. Of course, you can't do this kind of thing altruistically. It has to work financially. So we cleared our debts when we sold our farm machinery and our dairy cows back in the day. We still get a basic payment, which we know is going to go, basic farm payment, because that's just paying people for owning land, and that's going to go, we know, and rightly so. And we get an agri-environment funding in the form of higher level stewardship money, which is an agri-environment funding from Europe. And that is for doing the ecological things we're doing. We hope that post-Brexit, that there will be an alternative for HLS. It's called, in the agricultural bill at the moment, it's called environmental land management. And that will, for the first time, it will be actually incentivizing farmers and land managers to provide the kind of ecosystem services, the public goods that I was talking about, the flood mitigation and water purification and soil restoration, all those kind of things that you will actually be positively encouraged to do and be rewarded for doing. So we hope that that will continue and we'll still be able to benefit from that. But worst case scenario, if it doesn't, and with the vagaries of governments and subsidies can come and go, we now have three really important income streams. We have the meat sales, but we also have an ecotourism business now, which I think last year made 460,000. We make a 20% margin on that, which is a much bigger margin than we could ever have hoped to have made from farming. And we also are now slowly converting all our agricultural buildings. So all those sort of grain silos, those barns, the carving sheds that previously just cost us to keep the roof on. It cost an arm and a leg and weren't actually bringing in anything. They're just part of the farming infrastructure. Now we let them out to companies. Green People are one, I think, and Coco Loco. So lots of local companies actually rent buildings off us. And though those buildings, we don't directly employ anyone in those buildings, there's 200 people now in those buildings. So there's 200 jobs back into the rural environment. So yes, we're confident that even if worst case scenario there's no subsidies for us, we will be able to be sustainable. Yeah, this is a question about how could the government, any future government, incentivize people to do this sort of thing, so that it's not up to an individual making a choice. And I think this idea of public services, of being paid for the public services and seeing land not just as somewhere that produces food, irrespective of the damage that causes, is really, really important. And I'm hoping that already the culture shift in the civil servants is already so ingrained that whatever happens, whatever government comes, I think they'll be thinking along those lines. I think the other really important question, which has been talked about from all the politicians who've been visiting us for the first time, and I think is really exciting, is the polluter pays principle. So if that is actually levelled, directly and fairly at farmers, which it's never been, that will really change the question. I mean, why should we be paying for more expensive water bills if a farmer upstream is being irresponsible with his soil? He should be made to pay for that pollution. So I think that will really change the way people, and particularly farmers, think of using the land. And of course, incentives for doing regenerative agriculture would be the way forward, yeah. I think it's changing. It's beginning to change, which is interesting. It really is, and I wouldn't have said that 5 years ago. So we are now getting more groups of Farmers Union, more NFU groups coming to visit, beginning to think more openly. We're seeing a lot more farm clusters. We're just put forward to government a farm cluster. We've had 31 local farmers have signed up to this cluster, which will be looking at ways of doing more nature-friendly farming down the whole of the Ada River catchment. I don't think that would have happened 5 years ago. So I think, it takes a while. It's a big culture shift. And, I think farmers, have this, the finger pointed at them so much that, often I think the natural position is to be very defensive. And of course, it's not the farmers' fault. They've just been doing what, governments have been incentivizing them to do. It's really us and the people and the politicians who have to change the policy so that they, they can find a way forward much more easily. Yeah. Yes. I think it all depends where and when, and what sort of areas you're talking about. I think there is, if you've got a very rich chalk grassland, I think, with wonderful orchids, and it's producing, a wonderful biodiversity of its own, then I wouldn't change it. But I think if there are areas that could be rougher around the edges, if you could get some scrub back, I think that's always beneficial, particularly for things like butterflies, which have so many different habitats and requirements in a life cycle. So quite often they need different habitats round and about. One thing I think we're really, could be really potentially exciting is this idea of rewilding defunct golf courses. And I think there's a couple in the offing around Brighton. But that's one of the things that Rewilding Britain is hoping to do. One of their aims is to rewild 300,000 hectares of land in Britain by 2030. And that's not really a big ask. That's exactly the same amount of land that's currently under golf courses. So I think there's lots of places ripe for potential rewilding. So this is a question about how do we link soil health. There's a chapter in my book on rewilding the soil with our own health. I think that's hugely, hugely important. I'm not an expert on it, but I do feel, this whole idea of the human system as a kind of microbiome and what we put into it and how it affects it is hugely important. And I think, in a sense, the soil is like a sort of gigantic stomach, if you want to put it the other way around. And if you're treating it badly, then its systems start to fail. What I do feel, is that this. What we've done to our soils, we talk about, the yields all the time. We never talk about the nutrition in the food. And so we know that, we have to eat 10 tomatoes, 10 carrots today to get the nutritional value out of 1 carrot or 1 tomato in the 1950s. So I think increasingly we're going to start looking at actually the nutritional value of our food. And that will definitely connect our own guts with the soil. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.